And now for an Exploding interview. Stay tuned.
Welcome to an Exploding interview podcast. I am your host, Rob, and joining me today is my co-host, Ben. Welcome back, Ben.
Thanks, Rob. How's it going?
I'm actually doing pretty well, man. I'm feeling a lot better. Things are looking up physically. Yeah, now that I made my way through the surgery and I've started to kind of get through to the physical therapy part, I just need to kind of, push myself, within limits, right? I just need to kind of take it easy, but also kind of just start seeing where my limits are.
Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, it drives you mad, doesn't it, not being able to move, especially if you're the sort of person who is very used to physical exercise, and especially anything to do with your core, like your back or your neck. It's terrible. So yeah, well, it's glad you sound a lot better anyway, put it that way. You certainly sound a lot better than our sad friend here who's just lost his Yeti, I believe.
Oh man, we're going to talk about that here in a second. But welcome to the show, Chris Park, the lead developer of Arkin Games. Hello, sir.
Thank you. It's Chris McElligott Park now, actually.
Oh, there we go.
Not a middle name, double-barreled last name now.
I love it, Chris McElligott. Oh my God, I'm gonna mess this up. All right, so
I know it's hard, right? And a lot of people think, oh, that's just the middle name, but nope. My wife and I, when we got married at the start of COVID, we both took our name. She's a physician, and we wanted to have the family unity, a joint name, and everything was like, this is, it's a real pain in the rear for a physician because it's got to be with like the DEA, with the medical board, with all the, all the things, you know what I mean? It's a huge hassle. I was like, well, I've got to like update Wikipedia and stuff too. So I was like, we'll both do it.
Oh, that's cool. I like that. It's what they say is shared burden is half burden. So that's cool. Awesome. So very good. Well, we're here to talk about some of the massive changes that have occurred to AI War 2, but we haven't spoken in a while. So I kind of want to catch up on what's happened since AI War 2 released, and then maybe kind of bring us to where we are now. So would you mind telling us a little bit about kind of like the release and, post-release and how it's kind of gone for you?
Sure. We've had a couple of different stages of release, obviously, because we started out, originally this was a Kickstarter back in very late 2016. And then our first builds on Steam for the most alpha backers, ones that like the alpha wave of backers, that started in, I want to say February of 2017, something like that. And then we got to the beta builds for backers where we thought was going to be beta. I think it was October of 2017. And we had to completely redo a bunch of different things, what we called the pivot back, where basically the game just wasn't fun, didn't feel like AI War. And so we completely shifted and brought in fleets and a bunch of others. Actually, that was the second one later. Anyway, 2018, we released it in early access in October. And then we had a year of doing a whole bunch of stuff with, a whole new group of people, more than just the Kickstarter backers. And then after a year of that, in October of 2019, we went to a 1.0 launch out of early access. And then that was with basically everything being complete for the base game, except for multiplayer, which was held back because it's just such a gargantuan task in this specific environment, which we can talk about that later as to why exactly that's so challenging and it's kind of an interesting technical thing. But anyway, that stayed behind. And so then we did our first paid DLC, which included some of the stretch goals from the Kickstarter. So that was for free for them, but paid in general. That was the Spire Rises. We released that in February, March of 2020. I can't remember now. Time is a funny thing. The second DLC that we're working on right now, Zenith Onslaught, was supposed to come out last May of 2020. And that didn't happen for a whole lot of reasons. Among them, obviously COVID and everything going on there. I had both kids at home and was trying to, help them through their virtual school stuff and everything, while at the same time trying to get work done. And then also the multiplayer stuff just kept being a real rabbit hole, let's say. And then the next thing that happened really was Badger, who'd been working as a volunteer on the base game for a lot of years after being one of our earliest testers. He was a contractor on the first DLC and then same deal with the second one. And he just kept making features and he just kept making features. I was working on different things like the multiplayer and compression of and like mod support and all these different aspects for like the core game and trying to work on the balance and all that sort of stuff and get things to where DLC 2 would be a favorable thing to have happen. And Badger was just like developing content for DLC 2 like crazy. And we hit this point where it was like, okay, well, if we release with that level of content in there, every other expansion we could ever possibly do is going to look ridiculously small forever. This one's going to be like way overvalued, or we're going to need to charge like full game price for this thing because it's so humongous. So we wound up splitting that into two. So we've got DLC 2 and DLC 3 already racked up. And normally I wouldn't commit to a third DLC until we see if it's like financially worth it. But we already had so many things that Badger had built out. It was like, well, this is the way to go. There's still more to do. But anyway, so that's been the kind of roadmap of where we've been at. Been some other twists and turns, like earlier this year, what we call the paradigm shift. And that has been kind of a reimagining of the game while trying to keep things straight the same as well. We can talk about that later, but that's the most recent news. Financially wise, I mean, it came strong out of the gate, out of early access and out of 1.0, and then just kind of petered off after that. And the first expansion really did not get a whole lot of attention, but we're hoping to gain some momentum, and people have been enjoying it. It's just been very niche. So
on that, would you say that, do you think it's a fair thing to say that quite a lot of people buy the game because it looks really interesting and perhaps on the strength of word of mouth, and then they play it for a little while and they're like, okay, this looks really good, but it's quite intense and quite hard to learn. Do you think you might maybe lost people because of that? Because I've certainly had that experience with AI War 1 until I sort of decided to finally sit down with it and go, right, I've tried to play this like 3 times. I've got a half an hour into it and I've thought, yeah, this is awesome, but I'm going to play it later. And I wonder if there's other people who kind of had that same kind of experience with it.
I think that with AI War 1, that was undisputably something that was happening a lot. And to some extent, I think with 2, that's not happening as much. I think we have different dynamics going on. The store environment and kind of the way that players behave now as well. But when AI War 1 was out and new and all that sort of thing, it was something that Steam didn't really have refunds back then, right? So people would take and they also didn't have all that many titles on Steam. AI War 1 was like the 76th indie game, I guess, on Steam, something like that. At any rate, with AI War 1 being such an early title on Steam, they only added maybe 50 to 100 indie games a year, maybe, to Steam back in those days for the first 4 or 5 years of its life. So,
wow, I didn't know that actually.
Oh, yeah. When we released A Valley Without Wind in 2012, back then they had the new releases tab. This is not for indie games. This is for everybody, like AAA, indie, AA, whatever you want to call it, right? And it had the top 30 most recent, and it was just by date. That was it. And you could tab through them. The first 10 showed up on the very top of the Steam homepage, and you had to click a little next button to see the ones that were after that. And A Valley Without Wind stayed on that list for a month and a half. Wow. Can you imagine not having 30 games released in a month and a half on Steam? And so
probably 30 games in every half hour or so now. It's unbelievable.
Right. I mean, there's 100 plus games a day that come out now. And so back then, if we were on the main page or something like that, I mean, I don't even know how many million views that must have been. That was probably, for A Valley Without Wind, for instance, that probably was just some inordinate, ungodly number of views. That must have been tens of millions of views. They didn't let us track that sort of thing back then. Now we have Google Analytics. So I have no idea what metrics were back then, but based on what they are now and based on what their subscriber counts were, it must have been tens of millions. And with that sort of thing back then, you'd get people who would, there weren't that many games around to choose from. And if it's something that's kind of a little bit weird, but seems like it'll scratch an itch for you, you pick it up, especially if you pick it up on a sale, then you feel good about it and you have a backlog, but not like 1,000 game backlog. And so we had that sort of dynamic going on. Nowadays, we can see the funnel of people that are coming in and how many, bounce at each different stage. Like, oh, screenshots aren't exciting enough because they're bouncing, off of that. Or, oh, the marketing art capsule is not exciting enough because they're seeing it on a list, but they're not clicking it. And mostly, we do have people who bounce off the complexity. Absolutely. But I think that a lot of people self-select out because they're just like, the graphics aren't exciting enough and there's so much choice. Why don't I try this other thing,
To kind of follow up with that question too, do you think some of what you've done with this quote unquote paradigm shift that you've recently released and put a lot of effort into, is that an attempt to maybe streamline some of the beginning efforts and beginning like learning curve?
Definitely. I think at a core fundamental level, like the basics of moving stuff around or building things, the game is stupidly simple. I mean, if you've played an RTS before, you can kind of skip the tutorials and you can figure out how to get some units out and how to like get into a game and stuff. It's not going to be ideal, but you can get in, you can move around. It's kind of like if you hand me a controller or a mouse and keyboard in any first-person shooter, I can figure out where the gun button is, and how to reload. I probably press R, stuff like that. But then to use a first-person shooter analogy, just because I can like walk around and I can find my gun, that doesn't mean if there's like a bunch of other stuff, like I've got some sort of wingsuit and there's vehicles and there's all sorts of things to interact with and there's, complicated battlefield with all these different foes and there's advanced squad tactics and all this sort of stuff. I'm not going to have a clue about that, just because I know how to like hold the gun and reload. And so there's always a difficulty curve coming into a new game in a genre. So if it's Souls-likes, you kind of know probably you're dodging or doing whatever, but past some certain point, you hit a wall where you go, ooh, this is different in a very specific way from other Souls-likes I've played. I need to figure out what the meta is of this. And with AI War 2, I feel like once you were capturing your first couple of planets, I feel like there were a huge number of people that go, all right, I did this, like capture stuff right on my doorstep. I've increased my resources. I've made a few technology investments. This is all pretty familiar to me from a strategy game standpoint. I knew what I was doing. I had a short-term goal and I accomplished it. I feel good. Wow, that's a big map. Now what? And I feel like that's where we lost a lot of people. And that is the point that's kind of the inflection point that a lot of this new paradigm shift is based around. And to go along with that, I enjoyed playing the late game and the early game of AI War. I would take other people's save games and finish them. It's a lot of fun seeing whatever situation they're in because they've got bug reports, so they're sending them in. And I'm like, oh, fix the bug. And oh, that's an interesting save. Let me play a little, and play the beginning of the game. But I found it really stressful at that exact point I was talking about of, ooh, what now? It's a big map. I know what all the options are, but there was a lot of mental math that had to go on. And there were a lot of things where, well, if the things I can't see are A, then I should do this. The things I can't see yet are B, then I should do that. So in the moment, can I delay that decision while I wait until I can see the things that I can't see yet? And asking people to make decisions in advance of information is kind of a problem. The classic example I tend to fall back on is role-playing games. First thing, it's a CRPG type game that you do is design your character. Now, if that's visually, fine. You can design the visual of what you want to look like right away, no problem. But tell me, would you like an extra 3 points in wisdom or in perspective, or perception, I don't know. I just got here. I haven't learned how to play the game yet. Why are you asking me to spec out these? There's not a manual these days. And yeah, I've played a lot of D&D. I've played other role-playing games, but wisdom versus, perception in a looter shooter, I don't really know what I can take some educated guesses, but I don't really know what that's going to mean. You're asking me to decide this now? Let me figure that out. Once it's going to be actionable, So that's kind of the mentality that I've been trying to shift it to of ask the player to make the choices, when they have the information available to them to make an actual informed decision.
I would have described the first game maybe as like a plotter's paradise. It was, you had to spend a bit of time and energy kind of getting your information because of the way that spying worked, you know, in the scouting.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the amount of information was just absolutely incredible, and I like that kind of thing. But I can totally see how it would become, you know, quite overwhelming to some people. Like sometimes, especially if I'm a little bit tired, I might sit down and try and play something, and then I'll be like, you know what, this is just like way too much thinking for me to be doing at the end of a work day. Yeah, so
right.
I totally relate to that.
That's really fair. And with the second game, it was kind of a double-edged thing because, as you mentioned in the first game, you know, the first thing that you would always do is essentially play the equivalent of the scouting minigame. You know, how many scouts can I get through the hole? Like, I send 30 scouts down this path. How many of them will make it? Will at least one of them make it to the end so you can see what's down there? You know, that didn't work. All right. You know, and so you go through all this sort of thing. And so the first 15 minutes of every AI War 1 game was basically scouting. And I felt like that was a bad thing for two reasons. One, made the beginning of every game really much the same. And it's this weird, it wasn't meant to be a mini game. It just kind of became one. And it is a mini game, quote unquote. It's unlike the entire rest of the game. The rest of the game is about combat. So why is there a scouting mini game right at the start of our combat simulation? And then also it took away the entire mystery of the map. That was the first job that everybody had. So why don't we just skip and just show the entire map? Well, I mean, you show the entire map and it's overwhelming because it's something that's meant to be discovered over time. And so, you know, so we got into this back and forth of there was no way to prevent players from wanting to know everything immediately, but then also they would be overwhelmed. And so there were definite pros to the original game system, but I think it was during the pivot, actually, in the second game, I said, okay, scouting is going to be based on not time, but based off of your kind of progress. So every time you take a planet, that's you driving forward the progress of the game a bit. That way there's not this time pressure. Well, if I just sit here and fast forward for 45 minutes, the map will be revealed within that time. Or, oh, I need to do blah, blah, blah. You know, like a real-time clock timer would not be good. Basing it off of a reaction to the player making some sort of tangible progress in the game. Okay, you've done this. Let's see a bit more of the map now. And that way information comes in bits that are hopefully more digestible. And that's been the case in AI War 2 since before it released. But the problem was because you had those blind spots, you could not scout. You still cannot scout beyond a certain amount. Advanced players in particular were running into a situation where like, I've invested in these technologies and now nothing that I find later matches that. So I basically just got hosed by the random number generator, you know. That again was something that we took out with this whole paradigm shift was looking to eliminate that, but that's very stressful.
Yeah, and going back to your RPG analogy and reference, you know, you're saying that, you know, sometimes it's really difficult to start speccing your character into something and then realizing, man, that's like not going to work, right? And that's for me is frustrating too, because like you might have this crazy build that you think is great, but you get to the end game and that build doesn't work at all anymore. And something that I really appreciate that you've done with the new paradigm here is that you've now allowed players to refund science, which really allows you to kind of change your strategy on the fly. So like you said, you get into the late game, you're only starting to see ship lines of, you know, the exotic type, right? And you don't have any points in exotic, but now you can refund some of those things that you weren't using too much and apply it to the exotic technology. Really great. What was the decision process behind that?
Oh, it's the same sort of thing for me. I mean, there were two decisions in that general area. One needed to rebalance things in general so that people would not over specialize in any one tiny, tiny, tiny sliver of ships, because that was one fundamentally unsatisfying of, wow, there's a selection of, 30 different types of things I could be doing, but I'm using 2 out of those. You know what I mean? Right. And if anything doesn't match those 2, well, it's just useless, or it's like permanent defense duty or something, And so making it so that the balance curves on the lower tech levels curve upwards much more sharply and then start tapering after you hit about Mark 4. That means that you, instead of maining 2, you could maybe main It depends. I mean, it depends on exactly your playstyle. You could maybe main like 7 or 8 or so out of the 30 if we're just using, these are kind of example numbers. And you can, if you want to, if there's something you just absolutely love, then you can push that to the limit and go all the way to Mark 7 again. And you do get more power. It does taper, as I mentioned, after like Mark 4, but you can still specialize. And so that was part one, was saying, okay, let's not make it so that people are so pigeonholed. Let's have a few tools in the old toolkit here in any given campaign. And then secondarily, the tools that you have in the early game, maybe you really do need a lot of, ambush stuff and pike turrets and things that are really defensive. And then once you pass a certain threshold in the game, you've built out this empire and you have some totally new defense system, defense in depth, and you just don't need that ambush line anymore. It just doesn't make any sense. It was integral to your early game strategy, but in the middle game and in the late game, it's just, well, that was a sunk cost, I guess. You don't really want that. And so I actually had been playing Outer Worlds. I always have to pause with that one because I think Outer Wilds, and I was playing both. But yeah, Outer Worlds is the one of relevance. And I got a bit ways in, and I was respecking my character, and I was just like, this is so nice. Like, why was Neverwinter and stuff not like this, back when? And I was thinking about that over the holiday break, and I was like, I really stop having fun at this one specific point in the game. Like, and then it picks up being fun again later. But I really don't like that one point, and it stresses me out. I feel stressed while I'm playing that part of the game. It's not good. If I'm feeling this way, then other people must be as well. There's plenty of people who are enjoying it. So, okay, fine. Not everybody's bothered by it, but it bothers me. How can I make it so I can actually enjoy this? And probably that means other people will enjoy it more as well. And so actually my original set of designs were really, really radical. And they would really have taken things off in completely different direction. And I showed it around to some of the kind of innermost community members and contractors and so forth. And I remember Badger's comment was very measured. He was just like, this is really good, but I mean, that's a sequel. That's not AI War 2. That just changes too much. I was like, you're right. So I dropped back and I started thinking, I was like, I cannot change certain things because they're just too integral to making AI War 2 feel like what it is. For AI War 3, sure, maybe. But so restriction, as often happens, breeds a different kind of creativity. And so I went for something way more tame that really stuck to what the game actually was, but still tried to solve all the various problems within that framework. And that is something that I thought would take a month, and it took 4, something like that.
Right. Yeah, no, I know you have a core group of, contractors and people that you really rely on, but mainly it's you doing this. So I can understand how, a month, or at least a month's estimate, becomes 4 or 5 months. And I can't even imagine. And something else I wanted to kind of talk about, which I think I really appreciate too, is the choice that you've kind of created now. And, when AI War 2 first came out, I remember there being a lot of re-rolling when you got to a point where you're, getting new ship lines and stuff like that. And I remember me personally, I save scummed a lot because I would save scum right before I would roll for a new ship line. And if it wasn't one that I liked, I would just reload my game. And now you've made it so that there's many more choices, which I really like because it helps me integrate the ship lines that work for my strategy, or that I've already started to assign science points to and stuff like that. Is that again something else where you're looking at and looking, well, this is something people are doing, it doesn't really feel fun, now let's figure out a way to fix that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was of a bit of the opposite mindset, but still had the same problem where I never re-rolled. I hated the reroll, and I don't play Iron Man per se. But I mean, if I lose, I lose, and I pause a lot, but I don't go back. If I lose because I missed something stupid, and I've been playing a really long time, then I guess I will reload. But generally speaking, even then I'll just go, oh, good game. And so I would hit those things where there were not a lot of choices, and I would see it and I would just go, well, this is fine, I guess, And there's a couple of components to that. One is just kind of legacy baggage from the first AI War. We didn't have as much UI to be able to give choice in a clear fashion. But in AI War 2, there's a balance between multiple things all the time, So with the galaxy map, as that's generated, if you basically play it as you find it to some extent, like, oh, there's a Dyson sphere over here, gonna have to deal with that or go around. Period. You're playing as you find it. If there's a awesome capturable and it happens to be nearby, yay, lucky you. Again, you're kind of playing it as you find it. And there's this kind of rolling with the punches feel versus like if I play, I'm going to pick a little bit, but on playing Age of Empires 3, for instance, they didn't have random maps at all. Well, no. They had sort of random maps. I mean, they were a map and they randomized some little details of it, but the broad strokes of the map were really, really the same. And that wound up feeling really, really restrictive over time because basically every game was kind of the same except whatever the opponents did, which pretty much just meant whatever their civ was. And so it took a lot of the exploration out, and it took a lot of the feeling of, okay, here's a new opportunity or challenge that maybe I've never seen before. How do I deal with that out? And so versus like Age of Empires 2, that was there all the time. I really liked that game for that aspect. And so, but there's got to be a balance because part of it is you're constructing an empire, you're building this thing, and you want it. When you're trying to build something and it just keeps handing you the wrong Lego piece, you're like, stop, give me what I want. Don't do just whatever you feel like. Give me something that I can use. And so there's a duality between that. And so which parts of the game serve which master is a challenge for any designer, I think. And in my case, with such a large game that also is a sequel to a very large game, and people have a lot of very specific expectations about what is the AI War experience, it took me a while to figure out which thing should be on which side of the fence. And ultimately, it was like, okay, science, that's empire building. Text, that's empire building. Ships you find, yeah, that's pretty much empire building, but a little bit play it as you find it. So give the player, 6 to 8 options. Going with the old phone number school of thought, where it's like, 7 or 8 numbers are the most that a person can remember conveniently. Don't allow for this kind of gambling style re-rolling because that introduces the mindset of like, well, this is interesting, but what if it was more? And that's just never a good mindset to put people in. Yeah, it came down to kind of, and when I started out the beta period in January with the beta of the paradigm shift here, I wasn't entirely clear on exactly how some of that stuff needed to fall. I had a pretty good idea, but watching people throughout the beta and what they found fun and what they didn't and where they were still frustrated and where I was still frustrated, watching that over a period of a couple of months and responding, reacting, and having conversations about that really crystallized what it was. I mean, I could not have just sat in a room and made it and then handed it off. And here you go. This is exactly what I had in mind. It was this community collaborative event.
Chris, would you say that the collaboration side of things with regards to the game's development, has that kind of increased as you've got further into the development, or would you say that it's kind of stepped back a little bit and now you're more kind of focusing on fine polishing, and fine tuning things?
Well, I would say that it's increased overall, but there are times where I have to kind of just set aside player feedback and work on something like, just focus on art or some new features or whatever else. But, originally back in the early kind of alpha days before early access, Badger was he was just a player back then. He was a Kickstarter backer. He wasn't a contractor. He wasn't a volunteer or anything like that. And he was just the only person really giving, not the only, he was 80% of our feedback. Let's put it this way. And we had a few other people who would come and go, but the game wasn't any fun then, which is not a surprise. During alpha, games usually are not very fun. They become fun at some later point. And so he was one of the few people who was giving us feedback then. And then once we got into early access, we had more people. But then there's this consistent attitude, which I can't fault. It's not a judgment thing, but there's an attitude a lot of times with people where they're like, I'll be back when this is, ready. You know what I mean? And I totally get that. With a lot of games, I feel the same way. If I see it and I'm like, maybe see later after I've played for a little while. That's kind of where I'm at with like Hardpoint Shipbreakers, which is an awesome game. But I kind of hit like 8 hours in. I was like, I'll be back later when they're further along in early access. When that happens, when people go, I'll be back later. Well, if it's a big, complicated systems kind of a game like this one, then I really kind of lose out during that process. And I remember around the time that we left early access, we had a few people who were like, it's too early for you to be leaving early access. Like, it's not. And I'm like, yeah, most people were fine, but there were a few people who were annoyed at that because XYZ hadn't been resolved. And where my head was at that particular point was, I can't resolve XYZ right now because I don't have enough information and you guys won't play it. While it has this early access label on it, there's a certain subset of players that just will not play it. I've made it as good as I can with the amount of feedback that I have. Those people who were just waiting for it to be finished and final, this is as good as I can get on my own. This is it. Here it is. And then, you come out of early access and there's this flood of new people and they all have gripes or complaints or suggestions or whatever. And it's just this gold mine of stuff. And it's, so we made a humongous number of things in that period too. We did a 1.3 release, which had like majorly upgraded AI. And some of that was just Badger having some brainwaves on this whole new Fireteams concept. Now is amazing. But it also involved an entire rebalance of the AI economy on my part. We called it practically a sequel at the time, which is true. That's really how it felt. And that came out just a few months after the 1.0 of the game. And I remember taking some heat from some people. Why didn't you just do this with 1.0, And it was because I couldn't, without the feedback, I would not have had, Badger might have had his idea. I don't know. But for my ideas, in terms of how to rebalance the AI economy, those came from watching how players won or lost or what their frustrations were, all that sort of thing. And so that sort of thing really drives it. And when the community is lacking for whatever reason, then, a game is just going to be whatever that is in the developer's head. That's really all it can be. But once there's a dialogue going, the more people, the better. Then you start seeing growth in a new way.
Chris, I want to digress just a little bit from the beta, and I want to come back to it because I've got a few more questions about it. But there was something that we've discussed here on the podcast quite a few times about how we are increasingly more drawn to asymmetric games. And, truly, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe AI War 1 was one of the few, truly asymmetric games where the AI, of course, literally the AI was playing an entirely different game than you were, and you were, facing insurmountable odds. First of all, I'd like to know, what was your initial idea behind that? But also, going forward, do you think that this is a way to kind of cheat the system a bit and make an opponent for a player a bit more capable? Because that's where we've often, kind of come back to is a traditional 4X game or traditional strategy game. The AI is just not really capable of playing the same game as you are. But when you have an AI player that's playing a completely different game or is already extremely well established, then you can sort of do what you've done here. So I guess I want to, in short, the TLDR is, where did the original idea come from? And then how do you see this idea being implemented maybe in other types of games?
Sure. So when I was originally developing AI War, I started it in 2008. It was a little side project for me. I was working on a different game that later became Shattered Haven, which everybody hated. But I took a little side diversion of this AI War thing. And with AI War 1, back in November of 2008, I was originally, I knew that I wanted to have AI and I wanted it to be really good. But first I needed game mechanics that worked. So, and I needed it to be multiplayer and all that sort of thing. So first thing I did was I built out a multiplayer framework, and the ship mechanics and how you're building things and all that sort of stuff, camera, all of that. And so until about March of 2009, the original AI War was entirely PvP. It was never ever intended to be PvP. That's just how it was played. And so my dad, my uncle, and my uncle's friend Desmond, we would hop on and we would play on Fridays and Saturday evenings, and then we'd talk about what was going well or going poorly, and certain things would just kind of become obvious because we'd start kind of messing with each other in various ways. I mean, at one point there was not a fixed size to gravity wells. I was like, just let people go wherever. So, of course, what my uncle started doing was like sending his ships like just ungodly distances out, and then all it would take is just like a couple of snipers out there, and you'd warp into a system to go after him, and you're like, oh, for Pete's sake, it's going to take me 3 minutes to fly over to you, and it's taking like 30 seconds for the sniper bullets to even arrive. You don't even realize you're being shot until, and so stuff like that. It was like, okay, the optimal strategies in this environment are, really stupid. We need a fixed, arena that people can't just like go out into the infinite and hide. So it was a lot of things like that where we were playing, but it was all very symmetrical. We were playing against one another and hopping around. Originally there were no wormholes. There's just stars, and you warped between them, and then added the wormhole networks later to give some ideas of topography. But I'd been experimenting with a bunch of stuff, and all during that time I had been experimenting with AI. But I remember having this epiphany, and I wrote it up in this document and sent it over to the guys I was playing with, where I was like, okay, there's really no point in me making an AI here. I mean, we're having fun each week, and we're, part of it is the creation process. And we wouldn't probably be playing this if I wasn't actually making the game. But since it changes every week and we're experimenting and finding weird loopholes and messing with each other and all that sort of stuff, we're having a great time. But if all of us were playing together on a team against an AI opponent, what is that even going to be? Like, if it's just another one of us, it's just going to be a worse one of us. That's the best possible outcome that I could hope for, is that it is slightly less interesting than what we've been doing. And that's, and that's if everything goes perfectly and I make like the best AI ever. And that was a little bit eye-opening, because I was like, okay, this is just a non-starter for me as an idea. Like I enjoy playing Civilization. It makes sense, with all the different civilizations out there and so forth, with these space empires and so forth in kind of an RTS format. I can't conceive of an interesting AI opponent that we can face off against, partly because I'm not interested in PvP to begin with. And so if we were, other than like kind of the griefing and the casual stuff that we were doing with just experimenting with wonky stuff against each other, that was fun. But if we were seriously trying to like just outskill each other, that would have been not any fun at all, because then it's how fast can you click? It's a race to do this. It's all the things that RTS PvP always devolves into, which is the antithesis of what I was trying to do. So with that, it was like, okay, well, the AI can't just be another one of us. It needs to be another thing. And my favorite book has always been Ender's Game. And I was like, it's really interesting. I kind of wanted to make a thing where I feel like Ender anyway. And he goes in with a few guys and a few ships, and he's always outnumbered and he always wins anyway. And that I want to feel like, and I want the player to feel like Ender Wiggin. So it's like, okay, well, if I'm making an Ender Wiggin simulator, what would that look like? Well, you have to go from location to location. And in the book, Mazer Rackham is there, and he's choosing strategic targets as well. It's like, let's be Mazer as well. Let's roll that in. We get to choose the strategic targets and then we have to choose whether and how to engage at each target. And so, okay, target selection and, multiple paths and, it's an ultimate, home world that we need to go and defeat, but how do we get there and how are we powerful enough when we get there? So that was kind of the idea there. And I mean, I have some thoughts on what this means for other games as well. Yes, kind of a two-parter question, but that's a topic on itself. That's a really good topic. But
I remember reading on your blog, you'd made quite a detailed description of how you came up with the AI and why it is so good. Because it is a really, this was with AI War 1, I believe, but from what I've played of AI War 2, it seems pretty, on a similar kind of level of just how good it is. And that document goes into quite some detail. So if anybody's listening, you should go and check. I don't know if it's still up, is it, Chris? The blog, your old blog where you were talking about the AI development in AI War 1. But if it's still up, people should go and read that because it's really, really interesting. And I've got an interest in game AI because I was studying AI at university, and I just found it fascinating the way that you approached it. It's just such a different. I just wish that other games developers took that early decision that you did, and you were like, how are we going to make an AI that's going to play better than us? Like, how can we do that with a game like this? Well, it's not going to happen. So maybe we need to actually change the game, actually develop the game along so that the AI can play it right from the start, rather than kind of get the game design down first and then try to make an AI, that can try to play like a human would. That seems like a fool's errand.
Yes. So you actually just really set me up very well for the second half of your question. Those blog articles are still up. The kind of surprising news, though, is that I was wrong. I thought I understood why the AI was good. I did not. The AI in AI War 2 is better than the AI in AI War 1. I wrote the framework for it that would make this sort of intense computation possible. And I wrote the targeting codes, many other things. But most of the AI in AI War 2, I did not write, which is a weird thing for me not to do, since that was kind of my marquee element. But actually, architecture wound up mattering a lot more to me. Code architecture wound up mattering a lot more to me than the actual specific AI code. And what happened was the actual AI code that is in AI War 2 is a lot more traditional than the AI code in AI War 1, and it's better. It does take some of the principles, don't squeeze a handful of sand. That's a great principle. Design for systems that the AI can be successful at, also a great principle. And a lot of other, have a lot of agents that, so that you can have some agents make bad choices and other agents make good ones. And it just kind of, when you have, for instance, like a race car in a racing game, it's really obvious when they make a mistake because there's one race car. It's kind of almost a binary choice of, did it make a right choice or did it make a wrong choice? Why is it off in the, but when you've got 100 mice running around the floor, then as long as the bulk of the mice seem like they're making sense, then it winds up looking really good. And so those aspects were definitely correct, but it turns out you can introduce a lot more structure. And a lot of the really cool things about this are places where Badger came up with more structure rather than less, which are things that, according to my blog articles from before, that would be detrimental to the AI, make it predictable. It turns out not. I had it wrong. It all boils down to, at core, not so much which AI approach you use. You do have to understand as an AI programmer that yes, you're making a magic trick. You're not actually developing a true like general purpose AI. This is not a Google Labs project. But within the constraints of that, so let's talk about Civilization briefly, because I love that series. The AI in Civilization 6, we'll just pick that one because it's the most recent one. It has some things it doesn't do real well. And the reason it doesn't do those very well is that those require things like human intuition, or they require things like a lot of contextual information, sometimes emotional information. Am I mad at you? Do I want to be your trade partner? Have you given me good deals in the past? Things that are trade focused and stuff like that. You can if you really want to put a lot of effort into it, you can make a robust AI that is focused on simulating somebody that is a wily trading partner and, that sort of thing. But since so much of Civ is about, Civ is about a lot of different things, 4X, and so you can't really devote that much AI programming time to each area, generally speaking. There's a few like Galactic Civilizations 2 or something where it's like, oh my God, how'd they do that? They were Master of Orion. They seemed to 3, they seem to have just done everything. But with a game like that, when you're designing at design time, you have to know, okay, these are things humans are good at. These are things AIs are good at. And these are two separate pools. They overlap in certain areas, but in other areas they don't. You have an AI, a bunch of different things to sort in terms of like, what is the best option out of these from a numerical sense? They can do it way faster than a human. They've done it before the human has even started reading the first letter of the problem. So that's where asymmetry is a really good idea, because even partial asymmetry, because if we say, okay, there's maybe 40% of stuff that both humans and AIs can generally be good at, sure, make that the common ground between everybody. And then in the remaining 60%, they need to diverge somehow. Give the humans less of human-specific stuff they will enjoy. Things that don't stress them out. Don't give them a lot of mental math. You could give them a lot of mental math, but it's not something that humans are necessarily like keen to do. On the AI side, do something that doesn't need intuition. Give it something that is solvable in multiple viable ways, that doesn't just have one solution. Because if it has one solution and the AI doesn't pick it, it looks really, really dumb. So you need to have you need to have some granularity enough that it's like there's 10 possible options for the AI right now. If it picks any one of these 3, then we go, how clever. If it picks one of these 2, we go, everybody makes mistakes now and then. If it picks one of these other 5, then you go, what the heck was it thinking? And if the AI mostly is batting in the like, ooh, wow stage and occasionally has some flubs, people forget about the flubs, because even expert players make flubs, and that just makes it seem more human. So the occasional flub is not a problem. It just needs to, on balance, do an appropriate job.
You've pretty much telegraphed my next question, actually, which was I've got a few written down, and I was going to ask you what advice you would give to 4X game developers on how to approach game AI development, considering the lessons you've learned. And I mean, that's one of them for a start. That seems to be like the core thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, the AI programmer and the game designer, those people need to be of more or less equal status, and they're not right now. The game designer thinks, I've got an amazing idea for this new mechanic. This is going to be so much fun, especially when you get multiple players involved and they're wheeling and dealing with each other or whatever it is they're doing. This is going to be fantastic. And sure, that may be true with humans, but if this is a game that's largely played single player or only played single player, or if it's something that is where there's always an AI presence, even when there's humans involved, then you've just made a grave error. You've basically just set the AI up to fail, or you're asking for some sort of ungodly amount of like budget and staff and so forth to come in. And so, the AI programmer needs to be there from the start to go, no AI is going to be able to do that, right? I mean, this is a cool idea, but if you want to do this, we need to figure out a way that the AI players don't do it, that just the human ones do. What if now the AI could do this other thing that's kind of adjacent, if you like, and the game designer goes, oh, interesting. We could do that. We'll split that up. That way we do both, and then everybody does what they're best at. And you get this natural, since I'm the lead designer and the AI programmer, I just do that with myself, obviously. But I do get a lot of suggestions from players where they're like, ooh, this would be a really cool idea. And I look at it and I think, AI is never going to be able to do that. Although, if I change it in these ways, then we could have the essence of the cool idea you're asking about, and the AI could do it. Well, maybe we'll do that. And so those ideas can come from anywhere, but there has to be somebody with knowledge of AI is either fundamental to what you're doing or it's not. If you're making a 4X game, and let's say it's a single player 4X game, is the goal is to win, I guess, right? Usually, or to have an interesting story. And so you've got to have an interesting opponent or opponents. And it could just be the big bad world, and then you're basically city builders. I mean, we're moving back into 4X, there's opponents. There's got to be. That's part of it. So they have to be able to be smart enough, and they can't just be humans but stupider. And so fundamental to this genre, I would say, is, hey, AI actually matters. That matters as much as how smooth is it that you can put down your tiles or move your units around, whatever it is. And so you need that AI programming lead in there from day one, like before there's any programming even happening, going, that won't work with an AI. That won't work. This adjacent thing would. That won't work. This adjacent thing would. Or you're way off in the weeds. That won't work at all. And those conversations need to be had early and often with any new feature. That might sound extreme, but literally with any new feature that's added, if an AI is supposed to also do it, hey, we've got this new wall placing mechanic. Well, okay, that's going to be, a 3-week job for, 6 of us while we, get them to really make walls that don't look like they came out of, a Picasso painting. We need walls that make some kind of sense. Do you understand the level of challenge that like attractive human style walls are? Okay. Well, what if we didn't have walls for the AI? What if they were some sort of like star forts instead, where there's like a, and it's more of a communications network between them. Like an AI can handle that really easily and it will never look insane. And you've just solved your problem, but you've introduced more asymmetry. Oh, they've got star forts, we've got walls. Cool.
Chris, I know this is not exactly what we were talking about, but have you tried Stellaris?
I have avoided Stellaris specifically because it's so similar in some ways to AI War 2 that I just get depressed when I see the AAA ones that are really similar.
It's become a bit of a meme, actually.
Has it?
Yeah. Well, and especially through like the 4X gaming community. And it's funny and incredibly interesting to me, Chris, that you've basically, and I'm not kidding. I know you guys haven't been discussing this. I know you guys don't probably talk to each other, but 3 of the people that I consider some of the most like informed and capable AI programmers, which are yourself, Brad Wardell, and Soren Johnson, have all said almost exactly the same thing when it comes to AI, that they can't be playing the same game, that they need to be designed, like the game needs to be designed from the ground up with the AI in mind, and that, when you run into walls like you were talking about, like literally walls, you need to look at maybe allowing the AI to do something different so that it's not such a hindrance or, a handicap for the AI. And man, mind blown here, because I know you guys aren't like, having like secret little discussions, but you literally said exactly what Soren said in different words, of course, but like to the point where it just seems like that must be a very good way of approaching a subject like that.
I think the 3 of us in particular have had a lot of cross-pollination because Soren had just finished Civilization 4 right before I started AI War 1. Well, I'm sorry, he finished it years before that, but he had been working on it for a while. And I had come off of playing Civ 4 quite a bit. I was really impressed with his work. And so it definitely had an influence on me. And then Stardock was one of the earliest places where AI War 1 was successful before Steam. So Brad Wardell, he and I have never spoken or anything, but I've certainly talked with a lot of Stardock staffers over the years. And I remember I knew that they were paying attention because AI War was routinely like the number 1 or number 2 sometimes seller on their storefront off and on in the summer of 2009. And then in, I think it was 2010 or 2011, they were working on a fantasy game that was ill-fated ultimately, but they listed in their design document, one of the inspirations was AI War, and I was like, yes, like awesome, and thank you for taking these ideas and running with them, and I think there's some quote from, I believe it's Soren Johnson. It's like, given the opportunity, the players will optimize all the fun out of a game, and I was like, did he say that or did I say that? I don't know. We both used to say that. And, and I'm like, Wikipedia says he says it. I guess maybe he said it first. I don't know. But he asked me for a quote in some in Develop magazine at one point, and I was like, was that the quote? I don't remember. But I don't remember now. But we, so in some ways, it's just a small world, and we all see what each other are doing. And from a conceptual standpoint, I think that a lot of the earlier 4X titles had proved out this concept. When you get to Galactic Civilizations 2, or you get to Master of Orion 3, those well predate Soren or I. And, that shows me, Brad and others there had already figured that stuff out. But I don't know if they knew what they had figured out. They know it now. But just like I didn't necessarily know exactly what I had done with AI War 1, some of my conclusions in the blog posts and so forth that I'd written were a bit wrong. Most of that stuff, like let's say GalCiv 2, that was designed based off of technical limitations. You know what I mean? Working around the technical limitations at the time. And so, of course, it's going to be asymmetrical. We can't have a human level AI and blah, 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 right? And so, as so often happens, I think sometimes some of this stuff gets kind of invented by accident and then invented a couple of different ways. And then people start noticing the pattern, and then we all start talking about it. And the weird thing is this has been going on for 20, 30 years, depending on how you want to count it. And outside of the three of us, I'm not really sure. I'm sure some others are also doing it, but there's so many people trying for human stand-in AIs. It's like, why don't you just go play PvP if you want to do that? Like, that's not all that much fun. Have you played PvP lately? It's not very fun. There's a reason why this other asymmetrical approach is better, other than just, the AI is not good enough,
Yeah, and I mean, to follow up on your point with Stardock, it was Sorcerer King that they tried that was actually very similar. It had like a fantasy AI war feel, and
that's what it was. Yeah.
Yeah, and it had the same premise, right? You were against this already established, nemesis, and it was actually the thoughts behind it. It was actually a game that I really enjoyed myself, and it had some polish issues and so on and so forth. But I guess I'm just kind of at this point a little bit mind blown by all this, because I've always wanted to kind of get to the root of AI issues within 4X, and I think just as speculating fans, we've already come to this conclusion, right? That they can't be playing the same game. That there needs to be some sort of and again, we've mentioned AI War in the past. We've mentioned Sorcerer King. We've mentioned a game that's very asymmetric with regards to the player and the AI, and again, that's just something that I think could be the future of strategy games in the future, and until we can get to a point where we're developing AIs that are as smart or even smarter than we are. I do want to kind of circle back, just because I really do want to learn more about some of the new paradigm here, and I wanted to kind of have, if you could, just a quick summary from you about some of the leftover changes that there's you've written a like 15,000 word summary on Steam, but maybe you could give us like a quick summary of the remaining changes that you kind of felt were really impactful to the new AI War 2.
Sure. So, the main things we already talked about being like the tech rebalance, where you can go wide. There's a little bit less of a penalty for, choosing wrong earlier, and you can respec later on. Those things are all really important. Giving the player more tools. Giving the player more tools is another big one. And that is, in this particular case, with the hacking mechanic. So we had a hacking mechanic from the start, and it was always this little side thing. It was something that Keith Lamont had put in the first AI War after I had already left that project, and people liked it, so we kept it in the sequel. But I felt like it added a little bit too much complexity. I didn't really understand it. I was like, it's fine. Okay, we can sabotage a thing here and there. It's whatever. Fine. But I'm more interested in being able to look at the units on the battlefield and see what's going on and interact with the world in that way. Why do I also want to do this hacking thing? And I think that really showed in the game. Keith did the initial implementation of hacking in AI War 2 as well, but then it never got polished really. And so with the paradigm shift, I kind of finally embraced hacking fully, and made the interface pretty, made so that there's lots of choices. I added just tons and tons of new hacks that are interesting. So I was like, you know what really is interesting? I mean, okay, fine. I still want to feel like Ender Wiggin, but I also really do enjoy the ability to feel like, I don't know, not necessarily like Neo, but like I pick a hacker from popular fiction, but being able to feel like, okay, one of the things humans do against an AI opponent was we would hack them, sure, like that's reasonable. So let's lean into that some. And then as the beta was going on, it was like, well, what if we hacked our own stuff too? Like some people are annoyed that certain golems don't have enough health. And it's like, well, you can upgrade them a certain amount and they have more health and more firepower. But what if we made an option where you could hack your golems to have more health? And then it's not just like a golem rebalance where suddenly they're that much stronger, but it's this new thing where you're playing a new strategic resource. So since science was becoming something that you could respec, some players were understandably worried that, okay, well, all long-term decision-making is going to be a really, it doesn't matter what I do right now. I'll just undo it later. I'll just respec, there has to be some sort of permanent resource that is lost. So it's like, well, hacking points, it's like, those are not worth much. I mean, who even spends those to begin with, So I'm like, well, okay, we need it to be like a permanent resource that we care about. I need to care about this. It needs to be fun to hack. It needs to be integral to getting stuff out of things. And hey, wandering up to a ship and shooting it, you can only, if you're getting units from that, it can only be whatever it already has. But if you walk up to a ship and hack it, we can give you a menu that says, which of these would you like off the menu today, sir? And you choose the one that you want. And so that became really integral to the game because suddenly we could give you a menu to let you choose at the appropriate time, not like at the beginning of the game or some other non-contextual point. I'm about to get a unit. What do I want right now? I will pay this for it. I will get this specific unit in return. Yes or no? It's out of a choice of 8. Or I can try this other planet, And so that changed the game flow a lot. So suddenly hacking was fun. It was abundant. And we kept finding new uses for it. And let's see. Oh, the other thing was the AI itself. The AI had been winding up being very passive. It was hanging back and not really attacking you directly very often. And so what would wind up happening is you would get attacked by a wave very infrequently. And then the guys of the wave would go, oh, God, this is terrible. We're totally going to lose. Run away. And so they'd run away, and then they'd join the hunter fleet. And the hunter fleet would be lurking, waiting for an opening. But it would wait for the most ruthless killer opening it could. So if you were a new player, you didn't necessarily know that was even happening. I mean, it told you, but you might go, oh, okay, sure, it's waiting for me. So you go about your business and the AI is not attacking you and not attacking you. You've got no real sense of conflict. You're in a Cold War, but you don't really have a direct conflict going on. Then eventually at some point you overextend yourself and then it goes, goodbye. And that's the end of you. And you go, that was really frustrating. You don't go, oh, wow, that was super smart of them to hang onto all those units and wait for just the right moment. You're not praising the AI at that point. You're going, I'm so angry that, generally speaking. So that took a lot of rebalancing of how willing the AI was, the different sub-factions of the AI were to engage in battle at different points. It also took a rebalance of the AI's economy. Made the waves way huger and made them just suicidally aggressive as well. They're not allowed to run away. And so they come in and they crash on your shores and they probably all die. And if they manage to carve a little bit of a chunk into your empire and start heading in, so much better. If they don't, then okay, good job. Your defenses were tested. You just proved your defenses worked. Success. And so that changes the game flow a lot as well, because now you're getting into actual conflict, like not meta conflict of like moving chess pieces around the board and, ooh, you're threatening my king, or threatening my queen. Like you could take my queen if I don't block you here, not that sort of indirect stuff, but actual shooting war stuff. And just like you, some subgroups of the AI are able to regenerate within a reasonable amount of time. And others of them are like, I better hang on to my stuff for when it really counts. And so that flow gives more of a back and forth, gives you more of a feeling of conflict, gives you more of a sense of how dangerous the enemy is, because you're actually meeting them in battle more frequently, not just on your terms, on their terms sometimes. And that makes it much more natural, and it makes it so that you can feel what your situation is at any one particular time. If you're routinely getting kind of pummeled, but you're making it through, then you know that your defenses are questionable, and maybe you need to invest some more in those. You don't find out at the moment you lose. You're getting a hint of that well before then, and you can adapt. Or if you don't adapt, then you better win first quickly. So that's the last really major area. There's a bunch of stuff that changed, but in terms of major areas, those things really change the game flow a lot, and it makes it so that you're able to understand what's happening at each stage of the game at kind of an intuitive level, not this kind of intellectual looking at numbers sort of level.
I'm getting excited to play it again, actually, because it's been a little while since I've played, actually, Chris. I was one of the original backers. In fact, as soon as you announced it, I was like, I'm definitely getting in on this one.
Oh, thank you.
I didn't play it very much. I'll be honest with you. I didn't really play it a whole lot during the original beta. But yeah, it's become a bit of a sort of underground success at Explorminate, because it's one of the only games that we've managed to get any multiplayer games organized for, and I've unfortunately missed all of them, but I'm kind of getting excited for it. I'd like to know a little bit about the multiplayer before we wrap up, actually, if you'd like to just tell us a little bit about what's going on with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Multiplayer has been a really interesting challenge with this game, because normally there's an awesome article from 1998, I want to say. It's like it's called something like 1,000 Archers on 28 modem or something like that. It's on like Gamma Sutra and all these other places. It outlines how RTS multiplayer works since Warcraft 1 days, basically. And essentially what has to happen is everybody's got their own simulation, and it runs, and it needs to always come up with the exact same result on every machine. There are a lot of barriers to that, though. You can't use floating point math very much, because sometimes different generations of same processor, like Intel processors, will come up with different results slightly, and that sort of difference compounds. But even new between Intel and AMD, it's a problem. And you have other problems as well, like everything must happen deterministically in the same order. If you do these two same things but doing them in the opposite order, you get a different result. And so, well, what about multi-threading then? Because when there's multi-threading, what do you mean by order then? They're happening simultaneously. I mean, these things can't happen at the same time, right? So initially with AI War 2, came up with a solution to have deterministic multi-threading by basically chunking it out so that each background thread would work on a specific problem. Here, you do the addition, you do the subtraction, you do the division. Not really, but I mean, the same idea. And it's like, okay, fine. All the division happens in one way, all the subtraction happens in another way, and so forth. The results come back, they'll be consistent, and they get aggregated by one central thread that is controlling everything. So that's not the best architecture, though, because you wind up with just bottleneck after bottleneck, and you can only get so complex with the things that you're doing. And so we passed a certain point where I realized, especially with mods in the mix, and the other thing that's really required, I should mention, as I mentioned mods, with that sort of deterministic multiplayer, is you cannot make any code mistakes. Not one. If you have one code mistake, then you got to desync, and people have to reload the save game and resynchronize. And so it takes incredible code discipline, and it usually requires at least one programmer at the shop to be monitoring everybody else's code and telling them when they made a mistake. So you have the network programmer at Microsoft or wherever who's going around and going, you newbies, you didn't do this right. This is not going to work with multiplayer. And they go, oh, sorry, I had no idea. Geez, why is this so hard? You can't do that with mods. Modders are going to do what they're going to do. And so we were hitting all of these different things. And I was like, okay, well, determinism looks like it's out the window. Is there another way? And so obviously there are many other ways that multiplayer works in games in general, but not typically strategy games. An MMO has one central simulation then just gives you the pieces you need to know about. An FPS game has everybody in constant desync and then tries to reconcile in this really crazy way. Like, your head was in that guy's sights on his computer and he pushed the button and he got you with a headshot. But on your computer, you'd already backed up around the wall. And, the central server has calculated out that he did get you, or the central server calculated that he missed. He goes, my crosshairs were right there. What's wrong with the sniper rifle? So you run into those sort of things, and that is a rabbit hole right there. And so we've coded that way before for A Valley Without Wind 1 and 2. We had a kind of constantly desynced state of things, but as far as I know, that's never really been done for a strategy game before. And so, and I didn't want to implement that sort of thing. So that involves a bunch of prediction and reconciliation, all that sort of stuff that gets really, really complicated. And it works for first-person shooters where you have like maybe 100 people in a battle royale, fine. But it does not work when you have like 10,000 units running around. It's too much. You can't reconcile all that because the data goes like crazy. You've too much data to transmit. So I needed a third way. So what I came up with was kind of sort of pretend like we're deterministic. We already were. But then we're just going to make this Wolverine. We're going to make it self-healing. So we're going to let it desync itself. Then we're going to have a self-check module that goes through on kind of this sideband and says, oh, you got wrong. I don't know why, but you're wrong. All right, here's what you should be. And so what happens is most of the time, say, 90-95% of the time, things happen the same on the clients and the multiplayer, clients and the host. That is not close enough. The other 5 to 10% of the time, things are starting to diverge. But the synchronization thing is coming back through, and within about 5 seconds, it's like, you're 20 pixels still left there, bud. Let me tell you all about yourself now. And then it gives all the information to that thing. We don't know why it was 20 pixels off or its health was slightly off, but that's an indication that something is wrong with it. And so we go in and we say, okay. And so with that sort of model, it's been kind of controlled chaos and just kind of wrapping down the ongoing like little cross-threading bugs that show up. But it's in a good state now, where there's still stuff that pops up, but it's a whole new paradigm for large-scale RTS style multiplayer. I'm not aware of anybody else using this approach, so I'm pretty pleased with it because it's proven out really well.
It's kind of a shame that we're running out of time because we just did a podcast talking about multiplayer versus single player conflicts in game design, and I think you'd have been a great person to speak about with this because AI War 2's worked really well so far. Chris, I've got one question for you just before we go, and that is, what games are you playing right now?
Right now, I'm playing Final Fantasy 14. Actually, I got into that super late, nice. But it's still going strong at the moment. First MMO I've ever played, and because I had avoided them on purpose, but I felt like it was interesting, and then. For stress relief, mainly, I've been playing Ghost Recon Wildlands, which is not the deepest game or anything, but it has really satisfying gunplay, and the helicopters know how to work really well. Nice. And then I've been playing some Hardpoint Shipbreaker, which is an ingenious game where you're dismantling spaceships, and it's in early access, but...
Our buddy played, our mate Sean, the other staff member Sean, he's been raving about this game. And I actually jumped onto the stream the other day and watched him, and it does look really cool. I've never seen anything quite like it, really.
Yeah, it's really fun. I'm waiting for some more content to drop from them with some of the stuff that they're changing, but it's just so satisfying, so much fun. It's more fun to play than it is to watch as well, too, just because it's so tactile.
Sure.
And then I've been getting into Factorio as well, and a little bit of Dyson Sphere program, but I couldn't do that and Factorio at the same time. I decided because I kept getting confused between the two of them.
Well, Chris, as always, it's an amazing time speaking to you and really kind of diving deep on some of the development processes that I'm just not aware of as a big fan, and getting to know you through your decision process and really through your development process. And I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to talk to us about AI War 2 and some of the new changes.
Yeah, thanks very much. We've got DLC coming up on May 18th, and that adds just a metric ton of new content. So we're really excited to have that, making use of all these cool new tools and tricks in the base game.
Yeah, I'd love to have you back because, first of all, like Ben said, I mean, your knowledge of some of the development processes and especially the AI is just really kind of something I wanted to always pick someone's brain about. And more so, I would like to know more about the upcoming DLC as well, too. So maybe we can have you back on.
Absolutely.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Really appreciate you being here. And Ben, thanks for being here as always, buddy.
Thanks, Rob. And thanks, Chris. It was a lot of fun. Thanks.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
This was Rob, Ben, and Chris for Explominates. And until next time, keep exploring.